can see my frailty, my sin is great, and my strength is so small. Still you stay, and your mercy shelters me. You hold my hand, and you hear my call. You are always good, you are only good, you are always good to me. Though my eyes can't see, help my heart believe, you are always only good. Looking up, I can see your sympathy. I doubt myself, but I'm sure of your love. Lavish grace was poured out at Calvary, securing me for your home above. You are always good. You are only good. You are always good to me. Though my eyes can't see, help my heart believe, you are always only good. You are always good. You are good. Only good. You are good.
It was Tuesday, a couple weeks ago, I guess 3 weeks ago now. Tuesday, 3 weeks ago, Desi and I came here to church to work for the day. And we got here fairly early in the morning. And as we get out of the vehicle and are making our way into the church building, Desi finds a little bird that is hopping along the front of the church and can't fly. And, Desi's reaction is, oh no. And mine is, oh no, here we go, So the next thing you know, there's a box and a net and catching a bird and a bird in the office. And, the bird goes home with us. And, there's a bird cage set up in the bedroom, shortly after that. And Desi has named the bird Willie. And she's found out that Willie is a sparrow, and that goes to a little kid's story that she's familiar with. And so Willie the sparrow has taken up residence as Desi's nursing Willie the sparrow back to health. And Willie spends a few days in the bedroom there, and he's getting to fly pretty well. It's a pretty good-sized little cage, and he's getting his wing back, evidently, and he's getting better and better. And so by the end of that week, we brought the little sparrow back. We wanted to try to get him back to his environment and stuff. And so we brought him back, I think, Friday afternoon that day. Barbara was here working. Barbara Snyder was getting ready for her breakfast the next day. And they were here working. We brought the sparrow over, and we let the little sparrow go. Desi wanted to see if it would fly. If not, she was going to re-catch it, she said. But he took off, he took off. We let him out in front of the church, but he took off, run a beeline up here to the pine trees and the flower beds right up here at the edge of the corner of the driveway, and which surprised me, but he made a beeline up there, and sure enough, about 12 other sparrows come out of nowhere, and they're all excited to see their buddy back, they're all, so a minute later, you couldn't tell which one was him, which one was the other 11, and that made Desi happy, he was reunited, evidently, with his family, right? With his group. He was fine. He seemed to be doing just fine. And we haven't seen Willie in particular anymore that I know of, but he's back with his group. But he was a sparrow. And I didn't know that. I don't know my birds that well, but we looked them up when we got home and did a Google search real quick and compared some pictures, and sure enough, he's a sparrow, which belies the fact, of course, we can't overlook Matthew chapter 10. So let me start in Matthew chapter 10. I'm going to look at two different passages today. But Matthew chapter 10, go down to verse 29. Matthew 10:29, are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows. And so we have that familiar verse, that familiar passage there that, a sparrow can't fall to the ground without God knowing about it. And we've very famous song about that. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. And so I was thinking about that while we were nursing a sparrow back to health. A sparrow, of course, that came from the church. And God knew about the sparrow, right? God knew about this little bird. God knew it was a sparrow before I knew it was a sparrow, God knew exactly what kind of bird it was and what was wrong with it and where it lived and who its family was. And when they took back off that day that it was brought back and released once again, and boy, we put him back where we found him, but he immediately went back to where his family was, and his family knew he had returned and were happy to see him. And God knew all that. That was something that God was not oblivious to, something that God wasn't surprised about, wasn't something that God stunned him or shocked him in any way, because God knew when that sparrow fell that first day. And God knew when that sparrow had injured its wing somehow earlier that week. And God knew, I guess, that my wife would find that sparrow and pick him up and help him a little bit, at least getting protected for a few days so that he could get his strength back and get back out and return to a somewhat normal life of a sparrow. So I wrote down some things about a sparrow. I had used this a number of years ago, but I wanted to incorporate that in the idea of some of the disruptions that come along in our life. Because it's been a year of some, let's just say, thank goodness God knows the sparrow falls, because we've had a lot of weird things happening in our lives this year, right? It's just been one of those years. And I don't know how much all this has impacted you. The COVID thing has obviously been an overriding concern in our lives, and the way that it has impacted jobs and relationships and schedules and plans and school and all those different things, one way or the other. Some have been sick and gotten better from that, and we're grateful for that. Some of you, your lives have been impacted by so many other things this year. They've been disrupted by other events outside of just COVID. You've been dealt with other losses or other issues or other health problems. We've had the whole election this year. That's been an overriding thing that has certainly brought a lot of angst and anxiety and concern. I think across the board, we've dealt with that quite a lot, especially over the last couple months here, and continue to do so, I think. And so we have all these things weighing on us to the fact that our lives have been somewhat disrupted. This year's been different than every other year. This Christmas has been different than other Christmases. We've had a different reaction, a different feel to it, even in the essence of all that. But when I thought about the sparrow, I just wrote some things down because, when it comes to that disruption, the sparrow who hurt his wing, or our lives who went maybe a little off track this year, a little different than usual. I wrote, God knew, of course, when the sparrow fell, but God knew before the sparrow fell, right? He knew the sparrow before the sparrow existed, and he knew the sparrow would hurt its wing before it fell. It wasn't a surprise, of course, to God. I heard a pastor say this week, and it kind of struck me. I was listening to a message online, and it struck me because this is so such a human reaction for us, right? Things go off the rail this year, and we all go, what's God doing? What's God doing in the midst of all this? What's he doing in the midst of COVID? What's he doing in the midst of the election? What's he doing in the midst of our lives this year? I wonder what God's doing. And the preacher said this. He's like, if we were having a good, normal, everything the same year, we wouldn't say that. We never go, boy, everything's going great. Health is good, kids are good, job's good, economy's good. I wonder what God's doing. We don't say it because we expect it to be good, right? We expect everything to be smooth. We never question what God's doing when everything's just smooth sailing. We only question what God's doing when things start to get a little disrupted, a little off course, a little topsy-turvy. Then we begin to scratch our head and go, what's going on? I wonder what God's doing in all this. I wonder what's happening in the midst of all this. God did not prevent the sparrow from falling, right? He could have. He could have. The little sparrow we found out here by the church door, God could have prevented it from getting hurt. He could have prevented it from getting a wing injured. He could have, but he didn't. He allowed it to get hurt. He allowed that disruption to come. He allowed it to get injured and then nursed back to health and then re-released. He allowed it to go through that. And so obviously, just a reminder, if God knows what's going on in the sparrow's life, he knows what's going on in our life. He knows what we're going through. He didn't prevent it. He's letting us go through it. There's lessons to be learned in the midst of everything that's going on here. I want to focus on that in just a few minutes. I wrote down number 4 here. It's unusual, listen, for the sparrow to fall. In other words, that's not the normal. In other words, when we released that sparrow after he had been hurt for a few days and got his strength back, he went back and with these other 11, 12, 13 other sparrows that were flying just fine, because most sparrows just continue to fly pretty good. Most of them don't get hurt. Most of them don't get injured. Thank goodness most of them don't end up in my bedroom, in a cage getting hurt. Most of them don't. That's the unusual, right? The unusual is the one that fell. The unusual is the one that got hurt. The unusual is the one that needed some help somehow, in some way. Most of them just keep flying. Most of them just keep going about their lives. Most of them just go back to their nest every night for as long as the sparrow's life is. So that's kind of common for them to continue to fly. In other words, it's unusual to fall. And so, I think it's honest enough to say everything we're going through this year is clearly the unusual, clearly the odd. It's clearly not the norm. Obviously, things are different. Obviously, things are topsy-turvy, and this isn't. In other words, and let me borrow this new catchphrase, I don't think we're in a new normal. I don't think we're in a new normal. I think normal is when we get things going on a regular routine. I think we're in a bump, right? I think we agree with that. I think we're in a bump of the way that the pandemic has affected us this last year. I think we're in a bump of the way that things have gone. Politically, we seem to be in a lot of bumps. So that just may be a new normal right there. That's another whole story. But for the most part, I think we would agree that when we dealt with some difficulties this year, that's not the normal. In other words, if we look at the big picture, and Desi and I were talking about this. I mean, yes, our lives have been impacted by it. Yes, schedules have changed this year, and yeah, we've dealt with some different things. It's impacted church ministry for Desi and I. It's impacted, things we were going to do and things we had planned to do and some trips we had and things like that. Some of those things got disrupted, of course. But there were a lot of positive things that happened in 2020. And, as I began to write them down, there were a lot of positive things that happened in 2020. We were just personally, for Desi and I, we looked back and looked at over the things that happened and the changes that happened in our lives, and we were so grateful for many of the things that did occur in the midst of a tumultuous year. We need to look at the perspective of that sometimes. But the sparrow, like us, the sparrow was created to bring glory to the Creator. You know, he's there to paint the glory of God in his life and in the way that sparrow lives his life. All of creation is to show the glory of the Almighty God, and we are too. So no matter the good or the bad or the ups or the downs, it is our job and our duty to show the glory to the Almighty. Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. This is the other text I want to look at today. I wanted to look at someone in the Word of God whose life was disrupted. And as you turn there were lots and lots. In fact, think about this for a minute. Most of the people we are introduced to in the Bible, the stories of their lives, at least the portions that we know about, happen when they're disrupted, right? In other words, decades tend to go by with very little happening, and then all of a sudden, boom. And we're going to see that with Moses right here in Exodus chapter 3. You know, we don't hear a lot going on with Noah. From the time that he was giving the instructions to build the ark until it started raining, there was a lot of quiet time there. Building, yes. Building the ark, yes, but what all happened in his life in those decades? We don't know much. You know, God comes along and gets our attention from time to time. Well, let's look at Moses. Exodus 3:1. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. He led the flock to the backside of the desert, and he came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, but the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not near hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt. I have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows, and I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up out of the land into a good land, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come upon me. I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Come now, therefore, I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. I'll stop there at the end of verse 10. We know how this will play out, but here's Moses. Moses has spent now 40 years on the backside of the desert being a shepherd, working for his father-in-law. He's been working for Jethro. He's in a pretty simple routine. He had spent 40 years previous, 40 years living in Egypt, living as the Pharaoh's own son, having been pulled out of the bulrushes by Pharaoh's daughter, raised in the palace as one of Pharaoh's sons. And then he had that conflict where he had slain the Egyptian and then fled for his life. And so now for 40 years, he's been a shepherd. He's had a very quiet job. He's had a very routine job. He's had no impact on really anybody's life outside of, I'm sure, just his family. We know nothing about those 40 years back there. We know nothing about what he's done think about that. Day after day after decade after decade after decade, he's just out there watching sheep. He's just out there looking after his father-in-law's flocks. He's just out there in the backside of a very rural place, left alone, forgotten about, and by every indication, quite happy about it, right? Everything's fine until he's out there this day and sees something he hadn't seen before. And that's a bush that's on fire, but isn't being burned. And the interesting thing, I've seen a lot of preachers have pointed this out, but it's interesting. Verse 2, the angel appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, behold, the bush burned with fire. The bush was not consumed. And Moses said this, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. Verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside, then God called to him out of the bush. Listen, God put that burning bush there. Moses could have just walked on by. That would have been unusual, right? I mean, this was a very unusual event, a very unusual sight, something very unusual to look at. And so he was drawn to it. But God wanted to see if he would turn aside and take the time to see what was going on, and he did. And once he turned aside and went to see exactly what was going on with this bush that was burning but not consumed, then God began to talk to him. Then God began to communicate with him. Then God began to give him the instructions of exactly what God wanted him to do. Moses' life would never again be the same, right? Never again. Those quiet days of looking after Jethro's sheep in the wilderness are gone because he's about to enter into the presence of Pharaoh. He's about to lead a nation of Israel. He had 40 distinct years, 3 40-year periods of time, very distinct. First 40, grown up in the wealth and all the privilege of Pharaoh's household. 40 years of absolute rural, away from everything, quiet, forgotten about. And then 40 years of, I think we would agree, a tumultuous time, leading the nation of Israel. Beginning with pulling them out, and of course the plagues and all that, and then across the Red Sea. And then once he got that nation of Israel, out there in the wilderness, things went pretty smooth for him, right? No, not at all, right? It was difficult, and there was complaining, and there was problems, and there was conflict, and it just went on. And then, what would hopefully had been a short journey to the promised land turned into 40 years of wandering because of unbelief. And boy, I wonder how many times we know this. The nation of Israel said often, oh, that God would have just left us in Egypt, right? Oh, that we could have just stayed back there. I wonder how many times Moses thought that, right? For 40 years, it was really quiet. For 40 years, I didn't have to worry about anything or anybody. For 40 years, everything was pretty nice back there. And now I'm dealing with this headache all the time. Listen, God threw a disruption in his life. A couple of them, really. But we're looking at this one today. As things had been pretty status quo, pretty easy going, pretty quiet, pretty, not much rocking the boat for 40 years, and all of a sudden, he comes across a burning bush. And the next thing you know, boy, he's throwing down a staff in front of Pharaoh and picking up a serpent. The next thing you know, they're turning water to blood, and the land is overrun with frogs and locusts. Things are going to get really chaotic in the days ahead. God had a plan for Moses. God had a plan. Listen, we know this. God had a plan for Moses even before he was found in the bulrushes as a little baby. God was working in his life and developing him to be just what he wanted to be. But it wasn't going to come easy. It was going to come with a big, disruption. A lot of turmoil, a lot of topsy-turviness in his life. I wonder how much God's trying to do in our lives this year. Is he's just trying to stir us a little bit, right? Get us stirred up a little bit, and we get content. We get pretty complacent. one of the things, I was thinking about this during Sunday school this morning. Brother Walker's teaching. I look up front. I'm like, well, Christmas decorations have to come down. Christmas banner comes down. I'm like, last year, or during this whole year past, the banner we had up there was our 40th anniversary. Kind of came and went with very little fanfare, right? Because the church was so disrupted this year. I don't have a new banner to put up there right away. I'm not sure what we're going to do in 2021. We'll work on that. But 40 years. 40 years Cedar Hill Baptist Church has stood here in Dillsburg, Pennsylvania, and proclaimed the gospel and taught people and trained people and done the work of the ministry, supported missions and done the work for 40 years. Interesting, because we're just looking at Moses, who spent 40 years in the wilderness and 40 years in Pharaoh's house. And for 40 years, Cedar Hill Baptist Church has been here. I don't know what God's doing big picture in our country, and I, like you, believe he's probably coming back very soon. But in the meantime, maybe God's just disrupting us enough after 40 years, just disrupting us enough to get us uncomfortable enough to do something else. Enlarge our ministry. Enlarge our impact in the community. Get out of our usual routine and do something different. Whatever that is, whatever that new ministry opportunity is. Lots of us have been talking about that. We've clearly, up until March of this year, Cedar Hill Baptist Church, this church did nursing home ministry better than any church I've ever been associated with. But that stopped in March, folks, and I don't know when that'll start again. I don't know if that'll start again. Who knows? We just don't know. So what are we going to do next? In the 41st year of Cedar Hill Baptist Church, what's our plan? What are we going to do? How are we going to reach the community? What can we do? Listen, sometimes God just disrupts us a little bit, throws us off course a little bit, changes our routine a little bit to see if we can open up a new opportunity, a new door, a new way to minister, a new avenue to reach folks for Jesus Christ. What is that new door? I think we're looking at that. As a pastor, I want to help us, lead us towards that in the new year. What can we do different? What's our new opportunity for ministry in 2021 and beyond? I think God brings disruptions in our lives to get us out of the status quo and out of the routine and into, okay, well, here's something different we could do. Here's a new ministry we can get involved in. Here's a new thing. I think one of the things that's happened, and I've noticed over the last several months, and especially over the last few weeks, is we got more and more people stepping in, doing ministry within the church that hadn't done it before, or hadn't done that particular ministry before. As things have changed and as certain people can't be here or haven't been able to be here, lots of other people have gotten involved and done lots of other ministry things. I think that's an opportunity in the midst of disruptions, is to see new people get involved in new ministries, be able to serve the Lord. Throughout the Word of God, and then obviously in our own lives, things happen with disruptions. That's when things happen. They just don't usually happen in the midst of the status quo. And looking back throughout the Word of God, we talked about Moses here, but it was David, the young soldier boy who showed up at the scene of the battle, and the next thing you know is taking down a giant. His life was totally disrupted that day. His dad said, "Go down and take some food to your brothers." And the next thing you know, the ladies of the country are singing, "Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s." It's like, whoa, what happened? The little boy who went down to the battle is suddenly the hero of the war. Everything changed that day. Everything changed in David's life from then moving forward. I was thinking of young Esther Think of Esther. We have every indication from the book of Esther that Esther lived a very quiet life. She had been an obedient young lady. The Bible tells us that. She had listened to her cousin who had raised her. And next thing you know, she's chosen as the next queen. Jewish girl in a foreign environment. Her life was totally disrupted. Not what she was expecting. And moving all the way forward, I think I started this process as I was looking again at Mary and Joseph. Boy, their lives were disrupted, weren't they? I mean, they had no idea. Mary had no idea until the angel came and told her what was going on. She had no idea. She was quiet. There was nothing significant about her to make her a famous, significant person that we know of. Until the angel came that night and said, "You have been chosen." Her life was totally disrupted. Joseph, you're the one that's been chosen to marry Mary. You're the one. Like, wow, how often do these people have wanted to just have a quiet life? Like, boy, I wish things were normal, Wish things could have been quieter. Wish things could have been a little more subtle. Why us? That night in Bethlehem was clearly disrupted. The shepherds were disrupted. We talked about that a couple times already. Those shepherds on the hillside when that bright light and multitude of heavenly hosts, and boy, everything changed. Throughout the Word of God, example after example after example, and when God disrupted their lives, God was doing something in their lives. He was working in their lives. Things were changing in their lives. We have decades of quiet time, and then all of a sudden, boom, something happened in someone's life, and things were never the same. And I hope we don't miss the opportunities that come our way in the midst of the disruptions that have come our way. In the midst of 2020 and all the craziness that's going on, again, listen to me, I am an optimistic person. I am. But all these people are counting down to what? Thursday night? Friday? Convinced that once 2020 goes away, their problems go away. Well, something tells me you're going to wake up Friday morning and a lot of the problems might still be there. Let's be a little patient here. I am not obviously, I'm not a good luck, bad luck person. I'm not a person that's going to sit there and go, well, 2020 was such a, the year had not, the calendar date had nothing to do with what's going on this year. We have some obstacles, no doubt about it. We may have some obstacles next year. But we will say, and I'm a firm believer in this, and you've heard me say this many times. Listen, whether it's 2020 or 2021, this is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. God gave us today. God gave us an opportunity today. And this was my only caution here at the end of 2020. We dare not sit here at the end of 2020 and just say, oh, let's just get this year behind us and get back to some normalcy for next year. Well, we may lose the opportunities or the open doors or the lessons that we were supposed to learn in 2020. There's some things we could take from it. There's lessons to be gleaned from it. There may be some things that could have changed because of it, some opportunities that will open up out of it. I hope because of 2020, we can at least look back and say, boy, I learned some things this year. And we don't take things for granted. Even as a church family, or maybe especially as a church family, we've learned that we don't take just going to church for granted anymore. We just don't know. We've been disrupted like never before as we have this past year. We just don't take those things for granted anymore. Listen, in Matthew 10, God told us the sparrow doesn't fall without him knowing it. The sparrow didn't fall without him being in tune to it. And God certainly knows what's going on in our lives. Not just that the world is dealing with COVID, but that you and I are dealing with the outcroppings of that. That it has impacted us financially, or it has impacted us emotionally, or maybe it's impacted us physically. And God knows that. He knows, Matthew 10, I've said this many times. This is not new. But in Matthew 10, he also says he knows how many hairs are on our head, right? He has the hairs numbered on our head. And I've said before, I don't know how many hairs I have on my head. I don't know. Haven't counted them recently. Don't think I could, I will say that there's less than there was last year. I know that. Desi keeps telling me that when she cuts my hair. She's like, ooh, there's less and less. Yeah. So it's getting easier to count, I guess. But I don't know how many hairs are on my head. But if God knows how many hairs are on my head, it means he knows me better than I know me, right? He knows me a lot better than I know myself, because he knows things about me that I don't even know about me. And that should be a confidence for us moving forward in 2021, no matter what it may entail. I hope and pray we have better results in 2021. But no matter what's ahead, in the days ahead, in the months ahead, in the weeks ahead here, we have to see what God has for us. Open doors, new opportunities, lessons learned, and remembering that he's in control no matter what. Let's pray.